welcome to the Get Out of Your Comfort Zone interview series. I'm Andy Molinsky, and as you know, we engage in this series thought leaders about the challenges they've had in stepping outside their comfort zones in their lives and work, and also advice that they have for young people interested in developing their leadership potential. And today we have a very special guest. We have Tom Kolditz, who is the founding director of the Ann and John Doerr Institute for New Leaders at Rice University. Prior to Rice, Tom was a professor of the practice in leadership and management and the director and founder of the leadership development program at Yale. Tom is a retired brigadier general. He led the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point for 12 years. Gosh, he's got such a impressive resume. I'll hit a few other highlights. He has more than 28 years of experience in leadership roles on 4 continents. He served as 2 years as a leadership and human resources policy analyst in the Pentagon. He's been a skydiving instructor since 1980. And in fact, he was, for 10 years, he was the senior instructor for the West Point Sport Parachute Team. And then finally, I just need to mention a very impressive honor that was recently bestowed on Tom, which was that in October of this year, which is 2017, Tom received the Warren Bennis Award for excellence in leadership. So it is my great honor to have you with us today, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks for asking me.
So let's jump right in and let's talk about comfort zones. And everyone who comes on our video cast, I ask the same question of, and I'm always interested in hearing the answers, and I know our viewers are too. I'd love you to think about a time when you have had to step outside your comfort zone. You know, it really could be anything. I know you've had a really tremendous and varied career so far, but if you could just pick a situation that comes to mind, what was it like? Set the context. What were the challenges? How did you overcome them? You know, bring us into the situation if you don't mind.
Well, sometimes I feel like most of my career has been outside of some sort of comfort zone. When I was a relatively young officer in the military, I was partly advantaged and perhaps partly disadvantaged by the fact that I had a PhD. I had spent some time in graduate school, and so compared to my military peers, I really didn't know as much about military matters. But because of that degree, it seemed like I kept getting nominated for assignments that I really was not qualified for. You know, most of the assignments that I got early in my career, I got at a grade lower than most of the people who were working similar assignments. And in most cases, I was in a position where I had to ask for a lot of help and a lot of coaching. And consequently, you know, I spent a lot of time talking to more senior people than me and asking them questions about how to do the jobs that I was being assigned, that I was actually very ill prepared for, I thought. In retrospect, I think that some people thought that I had potential and saw that as a developmental opportunity. And I was able to do pretty well in those assignments. But it was because I was being stretched. And it was because I was being stretched so far that if I didn't reach out to both peers and the people that I was working for and ask them for help and ask them for coaching and ask them for mentorship, then I probably would have failed. And so I got a pretty rich developmental experience, I think, by having that PhD as a marker, being maybe a little bit older than my peers, yet less experienced, and then given opportunities to succeed by other people.
It's interesting. So I imagine that a lot of you know, at the Perlmutter Institute for Global Business Leadership that sponsors this video cast, I know we have a lot of students, not most, I don't, not many in the military or connected to the military, but students who are kind of in a similar boat. They leave college, they step into the professional world, and sometimes get tapped or asked to do things, or have the honor of being tapped with an assignment that feels kind of bigger than their britches, kind of over their head, right? I think, and what I've heard from a lot of people is that they feel very uncomfortable asking for help, right? That they see it as a sign of weakness that reveals their true inadequacy, right? That gosh, what am I? It might reveal the truth of the mistake that they were chosen. That clearly wasn't the case for you. And kind of what tilted you towards reaching out? You mentioned it a couple of times. So reaching out to peers and asking for help and coaching, was that part of the culture? Was that coming from you? Were there any risks involved in that?
Well, I think it was because I felt very self-confident in my own intellectual ability and my general level of competence. I was just in unfamiliar territory. And I think by framing the problem as purely situational, it wasn't because of any deficiency in me. It was just because I was in this situation that was challenging because of lack of familiarity. And that can be the case for anybody, regardless of competence. And so I think I was able to separate my own, self-perception of being broadly competent from the idea that I just didn't know a lot about these particular jobs. And I can remember one in particular. It was very, very challenging. I was running a staff section with about 15 people in it. That was an absolute mess. And I was actually, interestingly, working for David Petraeus at the time. He was a lieutenant colonel, very demanding boss. And I went to my immediate supervisor and I told him, I said, I am not going to be able to accomplish this by myself. I need a deputy, I need a right-hand man. This is the officer that I think should be reassigned, that I need to help me. And I just said, I just think we have too big of a job here for me to do by myself. I'm stretched too thin. And that senior officer would later pull me up in front of a bunch of my peers and refer to that as an expression of character, to admit that in order to get the mission done, that I was going to need help. He thought it would have shown a lack of integrity if I'd have run that little staff section into the ground myself just because I didn't want to ask for help. And that was tremendously reinforcing to me, to know that someone could look at that as an example of personal integrity, as opposed to arrogance or naivete. So that really made a difference in my life, hearing
Yeah,
that.
it's interesting. That's really striking because you could imagine a young person with less experience. I mean, you're stepping in. Is this maybe mid-career? You have a PhD already, so you're certainly not a young officer, right?
Yeah, I've been in the Army about 12 years.
Yeah, but I can imagine even a young person with much less experience, maybe even less confidence than you had in your own abilities, thinking of it in that way. It's a really interesting reframe that in some ways worrying about your own sort of vulnerability and asking for help in some ways is quite I don't know, an individual focused thought in a sense, right? I mean, I don't want to put the label selfish on it, but it's certainly individually focused. Whereas thinking about the organization, the greater good, the team, and that not asking for the help that you notice that you need is doing a disservice to the organization and to the team. That's a very interesting story. Do you think that this is do you think this was unique, your experience in being given stretch assignments in the military for stepping outside your comfort zone, or is this something baked into the culture?
No, I think it's baked into the culture. There's an expression in the military horses get ridden. And so if you show early on that you can get things done and that you can be successful, you become the go-to person. You become the fireman for units that are having problems or not functioning well. And you wind up working a lot harder for the exact same pay as another person in your grade, because military pay, of course, is fixed by grade. It doesn't really matter how hard your job is. If you're a captain, you get a captain's pay. But in terms of career advantage, it makes a big difference to be stretched, to be challenged, and in some cases, even to be made successful by other people. And that's where mentors come in to be protective and supportive and that sort of thing. But I do think it was baked into the culture. The military has a strong sense of and respect for legitimate competence. And they are more than happy to take a junior person and give them a magnified role than just waiting for the next person to plod along at the cohort pace to fill assignments. Many of them are just too important, too critical to approach that way.
So that's really interesting, and I think this is a great point actually to transition to my next question. And you inspired me by talking about mentors and talking and sort of answering the question about baked into the culture, because I know at Rice, from our previous discussions outside the context of this particular interview, I know that you've baked coaching and mentoring into the culture at Rice for young people. So you've really got a finger on the pulse of some of the challenges that young people might face in sort of developing their own leadership potential. I mean, very young, well, to me and you, young people, but college age kids around that age. And so my next question has to do with that, with advice that you'd give to a young person, listening to this. They don't have much work experience. They're going to go off and get their first job. They have ambitions of being a leader, but don't even really know what it is. Maybe they don't maybe even understand sort of the professional culture of the working world and what they need to do to succeed. What kind of advice do you give, or would you give to someone like that?
Gosh, I could go on and on. The first thing that I would recommend to them is to try to see the world through the eyes of their boss. Try to understand what their boss is trying to accomplish and how he or she sees the world, and then make that world better for them. It doesn't mean you want to be a sycophant. What it means is that that person is probably looking for someone who has the same or similar skill set and ability that they do to help them accomplish work and to get things done. So I do think it's important to be the kind of person that your boss needs you to be, not the kind of person you envision yourself to be or that you want to be. At the same time, with a simpler level of empathy, if you're given the opportunity to supervise other people, some sort of a entry-level leadership role, remember that you're doing that for the organization. That being a leader is not about you; it's about the needs of these other people on your team or in your business unit. And you have to see the world through their eyes. Or how could you possibly say the right thing to them? How could you possibly influence them if you don't even understand how they view you or view the world? So those are the first two things. I guess the other thing, getting a little bit more individually focused, is to realize that despite the best intentions of supervisors in the business world for the most part, if you're going to be developed as an individual, you're going to have to take charge of that yourself. That means if you're going to have a mentor, you have to knock on doors. You have to. I did a considerable amount of mentoring research in 2004 in the military. And I found that more than 65% of the people in the military at mid-career level who had mentors had knocked on their doors and taken the initiative themselves to seek that person out. And then those individuals were also good at maintaining those mentoring relationships over time. That is, if you sit around and wait for your mentor to call you, that's probably not going to happen. You know, no matter how much they love you, they're busy people. And so you have to take the initiative to grow your own career and to grow your own development as a leader and as a person. And so, you know, that's what I would say to people going in.
That's great advice. And you know, it's interesting. The follow-up question I was going to ask was about the most common mistakes that you see, and it sounds like you already answered that question, at least in terms of mentoring, which is to almost like undergraduates come to college and are assigned an advisor. I imagine that new employees aren't assigned a mentor. If they are, that's not perhaps all that they need. Is that one of the biggest mistakes in not being proactive in managing your career and managing the coaching and mentoring that you need, or are there other sort of common mistakes that you see?
No, I mean, I think that's a big one. I think that even in companies where mentors are assigned, those assignments are usually a little bit flaky. You know, they're not necessarily going to work. And so if the individual takes the bull by the horns and begins to associate with more senior people who they want to learn from, and by the way, they don't have to label this as a mentoring relationship. This is a knock on the door and, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just have a professional question for you. Then the control goes back to the individual. In my study, one of the things I asked these mentor-mentee pairs was, who initiates the communication? And 95% of the communications were made or were initiated from the mentee up to the mentor. You know, it just doesn't happen unless the junior person takes the initiative.
And I imagine there are plenty of junior people who enter with a confidence or self-assuredness to be able to do that. And then I guess my final question would be, how about the young person who doesn't feel that way, who feels for whatever reason, maybe they come from a culture that's much more of a hierarchical culture and they feel very uncomfortable sort of taking that proactive stance and reaching out. Or maybe they come from the United States or a culture that's not particularly or especially hierarchical, but still for personality reasons or whatever it might be, just don't feel comfortable being proactive in that way. You know, I guess my question would be, what advice would we give them? And I guess what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think when we find ourselves in those circumstances, we need to think about, you know, what is really the advantageous thing to do. And as distasteful as it is, sometimes we just have to put one foot in front of the other. And, you know, maybe they can promise themselves a beer afterwards or something like that.
Exactly.
But, you know, there's just no substitute for it. I think the other thing that they can do, though, is they can ask themselves, you know, if I really did want to have a developmental relationship with someone, what kind of person would I feel comfortable with? And then seek them out. You know, the company might not assign you that person, but you can go find them for sure. And, you know, start off slowly. Start with someone who you're 90% confident is going to embrace the overture when you knock on their door. And then stretch yourself the next time and the next time. I think also it's important to understand that there's no limit on the number of developmental relationships or mentoring relationships you can have. You can have one for personal problems. You can have one for fitness. You can have one for, you know, professional finance, conversations. You know, there's no limit. And once you get good at this, I mean, I've talked to people that, you know, would say, well, I have strong developmental relationships with 20 people. And that is hugely advantageous in terms of both leader development and career development.
So I guess in a way for that person I was mentioning, it kind of brings together the two topics about the importance of mentoring and sort of kickstarting your career and getting sort of the advice that you need, but also the fact that for some people, at least at first, it requires stepping outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, it really does. But, go back to my comment about seeing the world through your boss's eyes or a more senior person's eyes. Those of us who have been around a while, when people approach us and ask us if they can ask us a question or if we could give them advice on a professional or personal topic, I mean, I've done that hundreds of times. I don't think I've ever told anyone no. The worst I've ever said to someone is, I can't do it right now. Can we talk next week? And I think that's a near universal attitude. I mean, I suppose there are some people who are a little arrogant who, feel like younger people bother them or what have you, but they're few and far between. Most of us don't mind responding to people in that way because in our past, other people have supported us in the same way. But we underestimate that. We underestimate consistently the degree to which people are going to be willing to help when we reach out to them, particularly if we haven't built some other foundation for the relationship. And but the fact is, as long as we're respectful of their time and not over involved in ourselves and create a disturbance for them or an interruption, I think most people feel satisfied and pleased with themselves when they help someone. Well, I know that's the truth, and I think that's true too from your research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so this is great. I think people will really gain a lot from this conversation. I appreciate your taking the time to speak with me, and I think that you've got a lot of really very valuable things to say. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andy. We've got a great association, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime.